Great, thank you so much. So yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak as part of this very cool symposium. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that we've done in the lab over the past few years that's focused on using a computational approach to understanding social decision-making in health, development, and disorder. So why do I think that's important for rethinking the future? Well, we know that from climate change to infectious disease and aging populations, current and future generations face these really great challenges. And the solution to some of these challenges has to be in part behavioral. So it's going to rely on us making decisions that benefit other people. And if we think about pro-social behaviors, they are exactly that. So a pro-social behavior is a decision that I make that helps another person. And some examples of those are shown here. And these decisions are really crucial for maintaining our own personal well-being and health across the lifespan, but they're also very important for addressing these global challenges. However, one problem is that many pro-social behaviors are physically or cognitively effortful. And we know that humans generally find effort aversive. So how willing are we to engage in pro-social acts and to learn the consequences of our actions? And do we have specific neural systems in the brain for pro-social behaviors? And to answer those questions, my work has taken a multi-level computational approach to understanding pro-social behavior. So of course, there's lots of different approaches that you can take to understanding pro-social behavior, but I think what's very important here is the idea that we need to understand pro-social behavior at multiple levels of explanation. And this is consistent with the framework of visual neuroscientist David Marr. So Marr argued that in order to understand an information processing system, we first need to understand what the computation or the goal is of the system. And in this case, it would be pro-social behavior. The second thing that we need to understand is the algorithm or the rules by which we achieve this. And of course, there's going to be lots of different rules that we can use, and we can borrow these from topics outside of psychology and neuroscience. But today, what I'm going to be focusing on is two different algorithms. So first of all, efforts discounting. So that's how we calculate the subjective value of performing an action based on the reward that we might get. But this reward is devalued by the physical or cognitive effort that we need to put in to get it. The second algorithm that we might use is associative or reinforcement learning. So here what we do is we update the value of what we do in the future as a function of the current value, but added to this prediction error. And this prediction error just signals how unexpected the outcome of our choice is, and whether that choice benefits ourselves or whether that choice benefits another person. And then the final thing that we need to understand is the implementation, so the how or the physical. So where in the brain and what circuits in the brain are involved in pro-social behavior. And again, there's probably lots of different parts of the brain, and the connections between them are very important. But here I'm going to be focusing on two regions in the medial prefrontal cortex, so the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, or area 25, and also this more dorsal anterior cingulate gyrus region, or area 24 prime. And what I think is very interesting about these two regions is that they're not traditionally spoken about in decision-making. So often in decision-making, people might talk about this more dorsal anterior cingulate cortex region, or area 32. And also what's important about these areas is that they share correspondences in different species. So what I'm showing on the far right here is the brain of a macaque. And we can see that they also have this distinction between this more anterior cingulate gyrus region in the light blue and this area 25 in the subgenual cingulate. And what I'm going to argue is that by taking this approach where we've got both the algorithm and the implementation, we might be able to dissociate social and non-social decision-making at different levels. So we might find that we can use the same algorithm when we're making decisions that only affect ourselves compared to those that affect other people, but we might have distinct neural implementations of those same algorithms. Okay, so I'm going to use this to answer 3 questions. So first of all, how willing are we to put in effort to help other people? And how are those algorithms implemented in the brain? Secondly, how do we actually learn to help other people? And how are those algorithms implemented in the brain? And finally, can we find ecological influences on pro-social behavior? So how much the environment might change how we help? And are these different from behaviors that only help ourselves? So starting with the first question, how willing are we to put in effort? Well, if we look at existing measures of pro-social behavior, what you'll find is that people often use economic games. And these economic games are very valuable, but they might contain some certain limitations. So in this picture here, I'm showing the example of the dictator game. So if you're playing a dictator game, the decider participant is given some money, so some silver coins here, and they're just asked how much of this money they want to give away to a receiver participant. And they can do this anonymously, and they can choose to give away all of the money or just a small amount of the money. So these games have unveiled quite a lot about our social preferences. They've shown things such as inequity aversion. They've shown that in general, perhaps people are quite selfish and they're not that willing to give away money anonymously to another person. But in these games, one of the big limitations is that people don't actually have to expend any effort. It's just a simple kind of one-off or multiple choice that they make to give money to another person. But we know that these pro-social behaviors in everyday life, like holding open doors for strangers or helping out colleagues with their work, are often effortful. So we don't know how effort impacts pro-social behavior in these kind of games. The second main limitation of these games is they often conflate self and other value. And what I mean by that is it's really hard to know why people are deciding to help the other person. If the decider gives the recipient a lot of money, is that because they don't value money themselves very much, or is it because they actually really want to help the other person? And this is really important when you're looking at things like aging-related differences in pro-social behavior, because we know that generally older adults might have more money or they might have accumulated more wealth. So if they're more willing to give money away to another person, is that actually because they've become more pro-social, or they've just devalued money in general less? So what we wanted to do was we wanted to design an experiment that would look at pro-social behavior, where we could manipulate effort costs, and also we could separate self and other motivations. So to do that, what we did was we tested 39 young adults who were aged 18 to 36. And in this particular experiment, what we did was we got them to stand either side of the door and wave to each other with this kind of unusual yellow rubber glove. So that might seem quite strange, but it was very important to us that the participant, so this self here in red, really knew that there was another participant there that they would be able to make decisions for. And then these 2 participants were always joined by 2 different experimenters. And this ensured that people really knew that their decisions would have actual outcomes, so the self would decide for other. So after we did this random allocation procedure, we then got participants to squeeze this grip force device as hard as they could. So what this measured was their maximum voluntary contraction, so how hard they could squeeze, and that would be individual to their own strength. And in this study, we scanned people during fMRI at the same time so that we could look at some of the neural basis of these self and pro-social effort decisions. So once we'd done this, we gave participants a decision-making task. And on each trial, they chose between 2 options. So one option was always a rest offer. They would only get 1 credit, which would be translated into money at the end, and they wouldn't have to squeeze this grip force device at all. Or they could choose the work offer. So the work offer would always be more credits, between 2 and 10 credits, but they'd also have to put in more effort, so 30 to 70% of their maximum. So after they made the choice between the 2 offers, they actually had to squeeze the grip force device until it was higher than this yellow line, so they'd really have to maintain the effort, and then they'd see the outcome, whether they won the credits. And importantly, people made these decisions in 2 different contexts. So when deciding for themselves, they would choose between rest and work. they would squeeze the grip force device and they would get the money at the end. But when they made these decisions on the social trials, they would choose between the two offers, they would squeeze the grip force device, but these credits would go to this other person that they'd anonymously met at the beginning. So using this paradigm, we could look at two different things. So first, are people equally willing to choose to put in effort to reward themselves and someone else? And secondly, are there specific brain areas that code this pro-social choices, but not these self-benefiting ones? So what we found overall was that people were less willing to put in effort to help others than to help themselves. But importantly, there was also this interaction between recipient and effort. So I'll break that down. So what you can see is that as the effort level goes up, people are much less likely to accept the work offer over the rest offer. So you can see these bars all go down. But we can also see that the difference between self and other is magnified at increasing effort levels. So this means that people are much less likely to want to help the other person when the effort level is much higher. And this would be hard to predict from a single thing like a dictator game. What this shows is that effort really influences people's decisions to help another person. So the next thing that we can do is we can use different algorithms. So in this algorithm here, what I'm showing you is what's called parabolic discounting. So here what we're saying is that we want to quantify the shape of people's discount function, so how quickly they devalue reward by effort, or how quickly they say, no, I'm not going to choose the work offer anymore. And what you can see is if someone has a very low K, so these darker colors here, that means that even as the effort level goes up, they're really likely to still pick that work offer. They're not really influenced by the effort. But if you have someone with very high K parameters, so these light blue lines here, then what you can see is that as the effort level goes up, people are much less likely to choose the work offer, so they're much less motivated. So we can fit these models, and importantly, what we show is that people have a separate K parameter, which is this one here, which captures the shape, when they're making decisions for the other person compared to themselves, and also that the K parameter is higher for other. So they're much more like these people here, where they quickly say, no, I'm not going to pick the work offer. And this is very useful because now we can also compare this K parameter between different populations. So if we think about the case of aging, where perhaps as people have accumulated more wealth, they might look more pro-social. So it can be problematic to use financial costs as a measure of their pro-sociality. But using this task and this K parameter, we can compare how younger and older adults compute effort costs instead. So when we did that in a separate study, what we found was that older people were much more pro-socially motivated. So what you can see here is that when we look at the K parameter for other, the younger people have a much higher K parameter, meaning they're much less motivated when deciding to help others than themselves. And also the other K is much higher for the younger people than for the older adults. So older adults still distinguish between self and others, so these two bars are different from one another, but you can see the size of the difference is greatly reduced in the older adults compared to the younger adults. So what this suggests is that effort costs really influence pro-social behavior, and that willing to put in effort to help others might actually increase as we get older. So now we can go back to the results of the fMRI study. And in order to analyze them, we wanted to use some of these new techniques in representational similarity analysis. So representational similarity analysis is a multivariate technique. And what it does is it looks for where in the brain codes these distinct patterns of activation. And it does that based on how dissimilar the neural representation is rather than how similar it is. So what it's saying is that whenever people see an offer like this, are they distinguishing between the different levels of effort? And does the brain have a kind of increased neural response if effort is represented more distinctly? So we conducted this representational similarity analysis approach whenever people saw these offers. And what we found was that this anterior cingulate gyrus region, which I mentioned at the beginning, was the only part of the brain that showed this representation of prosocial effort. So it significantly coded this pattern of effort whenever you saw these offers for another person, and it did so more strongly than when you saw these same offers for yourself. So this is the self bar here. So what this suggests is that the anterior cingulate gyrus might be really important for processing this prosocial effort. So another way that we can verify that the anterior cingulate gyrus is important for prosocial effort is to look at the force period as well. So at the part of the trial, time locked to when people actually had to energize their action to help. And when we did that, we again saw the anterior cingulate gyrus, and we saw again that it responded more on the prosocial trials than on the trials that were self-benefiting. And if we look at research across different species, I think this is really exciting because we also see that it's really this anterior cingulate gyrus region that seems to have this specifically social or this specialized social representation. So as far back as 2006, Pete Rubeck and colleagues showed that if you made lesions to this anterior cingulate gyrus region in macaque monkeys, then they actually reduced their social attention specifically, but their normal attention remained intact. And other work by Steve Chang and colleagues that actually recorded in macaque monkeys from this anterior cingulate gyrus region showed that they could find single neurons that only responded when another monkey got rewarded, and didn't respond when neither monkey was rewarded or only the monkey themselves was rewarded. So this is consistent with that kind of distinct neural implementation for prosocial effort. So that was very exciting, but obviously the next step would be to see what happens if we can look at lesions in humans, because there's some evidence that perhaps prosocial behavior is particularly enhanced in humans compared to some of their closest relatives like macaques. So we had the opportunity to study this extremely rare and large cohort of patients who had focal lesions to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and that encompassed parts of the brain such as the anterior cingulate gyrus region here and that more subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. And this was work co-led by a postdoc in my group who's now a welcome early career fellow, Dr. Joe Cutler. So what participants did was this same experimental paradigm. They were randomly allocated to be the self participant or the other participant. And we tested this paradigm in 25 patients who had focal lesions to the VMPFC. And these were caused by a subarachnoid hemorrhage. So they didn't have lesions anywhere else in the brain. They were very rare because they only had lesions to this kind of medial prefrontal region. And we also compared them to 17 lesion controls who just had lesions outside of the VMPFC, and also 40 healthy age and gender matched controls. So participants completed the same task with real effort that was thresholded to their own ability. And now we could again ask two questions. So does VMPFC damage affect the willingness to put in effort to help others? And secondly, can we find specific parts of the VMPFC that code this prosocial and not the self-benefiting effort? And this is very exciting because now we can take this causal approach in humans rather than looking at fMRI, which might only be correlational to a certain extent. And what we found was that it was damage to the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex rather than the anterior cingulate gyrus that was very important for prosocial effort. So what I'm showing you here is the K parameter that I talked about before, and now we've kind of put it in the reverse, which should hopefully make it clearer, but might make it more confusing. So if you remember, having a higher K parameter means you discount more and you're less prosocially motivated. And if we look at the VMPFC lesion group here, you can see that as a group overall, having damage across this whole region meant that you were much less willing to put in effort to help another person. So this self-other difference was greatly enhanced compared to both the lesion control group and compared to the healthy control group. And as I mentioned, when we mapped that specifically onto the brain, so we took this new computational lesion symptom mapping approach, where we could take the K parameter and then how much damage occurred within this part of the brain. And what we could show was that if you had damage particularly to this subgenual anterior cingulate cortex area, here shown in the red and yellow, then that really magnified this difference in helping other people compared to helping oneself. So we could show that this part of the brain was really causally implicated in decisions to help another person. So to summarize all of that first part, what we showed was that young adults are less willing to put an effort to help another person than themselves, particularly when the effort costs are high. Whereas older adults might have relatively higher pro-social motivation. And we could also show that in a task where the cost was not financial, but instead it was effortful. Secondly, I showed you that this anterior cingulate gyrus region carries a specific neural representation of pro-social effort. And finally, when we looked at the lesion study, instead we found it was this more subgenual anterior cingulate cortex region where damage causally contributed to pro-social and not self-benefiting effort. So moving on to the second part of my talk, what's very important, of course, is we have to put in effort to help other people, but we do also need to be able to learn from the outcomes of our choices and whether they actually helped another person or failed to help them. And again, if we want to understand learning to help, then we can look to non-social algorithms outside of social neuroscience. So we can, for example, look to reinforcement or associative learning theory. And in this framework, what they argue is very much like the effort-based decision-making framework. But now the idea is that the subjective value is going to be updated over time. So here now the subjective value in the future is a function of the current subjective value of me picking a particular choice. And that's scaled by this learning rate, which is just like the K parameter. So everyone will have a different learning rate, so speed in which they kind of update information. And the learning rate scales this prediction error. And the idea of the prediction error is that it's not the actual reward that you get after you make a decision, but it's how unexpected that reward is. So how unexpected the outcome of my decision is. And that's what's shown here. So the prediction error is just the reward minus the value of what you thought you were going to get. And this framework isn't just theoretical. We know that there's a biological basis to it as well. So in seminal work by Wolfram Schultz and colleagues, what they showed was that there were dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area that showed a prediction error-like signal. So that is, they really increased their firing rate. So what you can see here, when rewards were not predicted but actually occurred, which is consistent with a positive prediction error. But they also really suppressed their firing rate when rewards were really predicted but actually didn't occur, consistent with a negative prediction error. And since the seminal work in monkeys, it's been shown that in humans that regions that received input from this ventral tegmental area also show a prediction error-like signal. And those regions include the two that I spoke about at the beginning that I'm very interested in, so the anterior cingulate gyrus and the subgenual ACC. So this is all to say that we were really interested in how do we actually learn to benefit others? Can we use this associative learning framework, and can we isolate some of these specific neural signals that are activated when I make a choice to help another person, and are they different from when I make a choice that only benefits myself? So this was a study done a few years ago now, and what we did was we tested 31 young adults. We did this rubber glove procedure, and we also tested them during fMRI scanning. And now what we asked participants to do was to play this probabilistic learning task. So again, there were multiple conditions. So a self condition, a pro-social or other condition, and a no one condition. So in the self condition, people saw these two different abstract images. They were told that one was associated with a high probability of reward and one with a low probability of reward. And after they picked the objects, they then got feedback telling them if they were right or wrong. And if they were right, they would get 100 points. And if they were wrong, they would get 0 points. And because these pictures are probabilistically associated with reward, people can just learn by trial and error to pick the correct option. That also meant at the time of the outcome, we could actually compute a prediction error. So as they updated the value of these options over time, the size of the prediction error would change. And crucially, sometimes people played this for themselves, so they made the choices and they got the money. Sometimes they made these choices pro-socially, where they would choose that this anonymous other person they met at the beginning would get the money. And this time we could also include this third control condition, the no one condition. So that might seem a bit strange, but the idea here is that people saw the points, but they weren't translated into any money, either for the participant themselves or for the other person. And we thought that this could control for parts of the brain that might signal things such as this reward is not going to me. So here we could ask, do people learn at different rates to benefit self, other, and no one? So can we look at separate learning rates for these three conditions? And secondly, are there specific brain areas that are involved in this pro-social, but not in this self-benefiting or no one learning? And what we saw was that people had a much higher learning rate about their own reward outcomes than outcomes given to another person or no one. And this also correlated with accuracy. So having a higher learning rate meant people were more accurate on the task. So then we can look at the neural system. So every time people see this prediction error for the other person, and we saw that the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, so the region I spoke about on the previous slides, was the only part of the brain that signaled this pro-social prediction error. So it tracked trial by trial every time there was a prediction error, but only for another person, and that did not respond to your own prediction errors or even prediction errors that were not for self or other. So this was very exciting to find that this part of the brain specifically signaled any action that I made that kind of helped another person. So again, that was very cool, but we wanted to see whether we could causally manipulate the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. So again, we could look to this rare cohort of patients that we had tested, and we gave them the same pro-social learning task. And this is work led by a PhD student in our group, Margot. So Margot was interested to test these 28 patients who had the focal VMPFC lesions, so a very unusually large sample. This time we had 21 lesion controls, as well as a very large sample of age and gender matched controls. And all participants completed the same pro-social learning task, so we could then again measure the learning rates between the different conditions and look at the accuracy too. And we wanted to ask, does VMPFC damage change how people learn to benefit self, other, or no one? And secondly, can we find specific parts of VMPFC that are involved in pro-social and not self-benefiting or no one learning? So first, what I'm going to just show you is the accuracy in the different patient groups. And this is for people just if they had VMPFC damage or whether they had damage outside of VMPFC. So the first thing that we can see is that VMPFC patients were much less accurate when benefiting another person compared to no one. And that pattern is very unusual because if you remember, healthy controls kind of treat other and no one the same, which is exactly what we saw here. And that was similar in the lesion controls because the error bars were quite large, and if anything, it's a bit positive. So you can see that VMPFC lesion patients were quite unique in that their accuracy at benefiting another person, so picking the right symbol, was greatly reduced, even compared to no one, when neither person would actually get a reward. And this is consistent with VMPFC damage disrupting pro-social learning. But we also know that VMPFC is generally very involved in reinforcement learning, so we thought that we might see some differences even for self-benefiting learning. And what was very interesting here was that actually VMPFC patients treated both the self and the no one condition the same, so it wasn't different from zero. And this is a very unusual pattern because we know that in general, people seem to have this self-benefiting bias, which I spoke about before. So people are much more accurate at learning about their own outcomes where they actually get money compared to when no one gets the outcome. And that's exactly what we see in healthy controls and in lesion controls, with the VMPFC patients being the most unusual in this pattern. So next, what we can do, just like in the first study, is to try and figure out where in VMPFC might be related to some of these deficits. So are there particular parts of VMPFC where if you have damage, your disruption to prosocial learning is greatly enhanced? So what we did was we fit lots of different computational models. I won't go into all of the details for those, but the important part was that we had models that separately had positive prediction errors and negative prediction errors. So when we plot them, so now what we're looking at is other prediction errors compared to no one prediction errors. So this is where you'd expect it to be higher in the healthy controls and in the lesion controls, which is exactly what we find. We can see that VMPFC patients have this very atypical signaling. And we found that that atypical signaling was specifically related to this subgenual ACC region. So if you had damage here, you had atypical prediction error signaling when your learnings benefit the other person compared to no one. And what we also saw was, again, the subgenual ACC was affecting prosocial learning, but this time also this more anterior cingulate gyrus region. And when we look at what happens here, instead we can see that there's something unusual going on with the negative prediction errors. So VMPFC patients had this weirdly enhanced negative prediction error signaling whenever they benefited another person compared to when they benefited themselves. And when you take the magnitude of this difference and plot it onto the brain, you can see, as I said, it's this subgenual area and this anterior cingulate gyrus, suggesting that lesions to these particular parts of the brain can actually create this atypical negative prediction error signaling for other people as well. Okay, so to summarize that part, people seem to learn at a slower rate to reward other people compared to themselves, and the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex seems to track these prosocial prediction errors. And finally, when we look at this computational model-based lesion symptom mapping, what's very exciting is we see the subgenual ACC and this anterior cingulate gyrus region where it's really damage here that affects your ability to learn about prediction errors that help another person compared to yourself or no one. So in the final, much shorter part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about some very recent work that we've done where we try to look more at these ecological or environmental influences on prosocial behavior. And currently we haven't done this in imaging, but I hope to share the imaging results with you in the future. So what do we mean by ecological influences? Well, this is work led by Dr. Todd Vogel in my lab. So if we think about the kind of everyday decisions that we make, it's not really about choosing between working or resting or apples and oranges. Instead, what we do is we're making decisions at every moment in time about whether we're going to interrupt what we're doing now in order to do something else. So am I going to carry on listening to this talk, or am I going to go on my phone or perhaps check my email? Every time it's not this kind of A or B, it's a kind of ongoing decision process that we interrupt in order to do something else. And it's been suggested that this might be based on opportunity costs. So perhaps our brains are constantly evaluating how good everything else that we could be doing is compared to what we are doing now. And to make that a bit clearer, we can again look to animal neuroscience or theories from ecology. An animal foraging theory suggests that when animals or humans decide to act is based on the richness of their environment. So imagine you're this leopard here, and you've got to decide when you pounce to try and get food. You've got all of these buffalo behind you. So what you're going to do is you're going to decide when to act based on how good all of the buffaloes in the environment are. If there's lots and lots of juicy buffaloes that are available, maybe the animal won't pounce right now because they know that the next one will also be juicy and tasty and available. But if there's only very sparse buffalo and perhaps they're very skinny and aren't going to provide much food, and you see even one appear, you're much more likely to take it because you know that the next one is probably not going to be of very good quality either. So animal foraging theory suggests that animal brains are making these assessments all the time, and they're not choosing what to act upon, but instead when they decide to act. And we also know, if we look at a completely separate field of social psychology, that there's controversial evidence that suggests that people, when they're in poorer environments, are more pro-social. So we wanted to use this animal foraging framework to design a task that could assess when people decide to help others. So our question was, does when we decide to help others depend on the environment? So in this pro-social ecology task, which we did across 3 separate samples where we replicated the results each time, what we did was we first of all told people what kind of environment they were in. So we told them whether they were in a rich environment or a poor environment. And these environments were constructed by the frequency of offers that you would see. So just like with the buffalo, whether you see lots and lots of good buffalo around or whether you only see a few good ones, in the poor environment, generally you would encounter these low magnitude, low probability offers. Whereas in the rich environment, generally you would encounter more high probability and high magnitude offers. So just by changing the frequency of offers that you saw during the task, we could create these different poor and rich environments. So after they knew what environment they were in, we then presented them with these different offers that were either for themselves or this anonymous other person. And these offers always signaled 2 things. So as I mentioned, the reward magnitude, whether it was 5, 10, or 20 credits, and also the reward probability. So how many dots were filled in the circle represented how likely it was that you would get this offer. So people would, if they wanted to accept the offer, they would press spacebar. And if they press spacebar, they would have to do this fixed effort task. And if they successfully completed the effort task and the probability was high enough, then they would see the outcome, which in this case was getting credits. But importantly, they could also just carry on watching a video. So the whole time they're doing this task, there's a nature documentary in the background to make it more ecological. So they can carry on watching the movie and they just don't have to do anything. And then they see the outcome at the time it kind of would have come. So if they also accept the offer, then this fixed effort task actually skips some of the movie. So that's meant to make it just like real life. In real life, you really have to skip what you're watching. Or they just carry on watching it. So what I'm going to try and do now is show you a video so you can actually see what the participants saw, and this may or may not work. So let's just give it a go and hopefully it doesn't skip too much.
The surface of the ocean conceals the many creatures that live beneath.
You can see they take the effortful option there, skips the movie.
But not all.
So that was an example there. Hopefully that worked. So you can see it's quite an engaging task. People are basically doing what they do at home. You're watching something and you decide whether to interrupt what you're doing to help yourself or someone else. So the first thing we found that was really cool was that people are still quite pro-social when there's an enjoyable alternative. So people are still quite likely to accept to interrupt the movie on these other trials compared to self-trials. So this is almost 50% of the time they're still stopping the video. Obviously not everyone is doing that, but what we wondered with the pro-social effort stuff is, are people sometimes just picking to help others out of boredom? But this suggests even when people aren't bored, they'll kind of pick the nice pro-social option. The second thing that we saw was that if we take the same offers, so the offer in the middle, people are more likely to interrupt what they're doing in the poor environment compared to the rich environment. And that's exactly what we see in non-human animals, that they're more likely to interrupt what they're doing if they're in a poor environment to take the offers that are available now compared to when they're in a rich environment. And finally, of course, we wanted to put that all together and see how it was modulated by expected value. So what we can see here is the same thing again. So for the self condition, people are more likely to interrupt, particularly at the higher expected values in the self condition in the poor environment than in the rich environment. We saw the same thing for the social condition. So again, at higher expected value, people are more likely to interrupt in the poor environment for other than the rich environment for other. And when we put that all together, we can see that we can say that humans are more likely to help others in poor compared to rich environments, and that effect is greatly enhanced. So the difference between these lines is much greater than when we're making the same decisions for ourselves. So we wanted to follow this up by building lots of computational models, and I won't go into too much detail with them. But importantly, the model that we found, one, had these separate opportunity cost parameters for different recipients, so for self and other, and also for different environments, so whether environments were poor or rich. And that's important because now we can compare these different O parameters. This is also just showing that all of our parameters were recoverable. Okay, so comparing the 4 different opportunity costs, again, what we can see is that we replicate this just model-free choice behavior. So the poor environment, people are much more willing to accept for other and for self. But again, we can see the difference between poor and rich environments is greatly enhanced in the social condition. And intriguingly, because we've got this computational model, we can also compare how much people actually follow their choices, so how sensitive they are to value. And what's really interesting in when we do that actually the poor environment for other has a similar value sensitivity as the rich environment for self. So this is Bayesian evidence showing there weren't any difference between these 2 bars. And it's very, very hard in social decision-making studies to get people to treat self and other the same. So we found this really cool that the rich environment for self was treated in a similar way to the poor environment for other. And then a final thing, we wanted to see how this mapped onto individual differences. So people filled in lots of different questionnaires, and we had these different factors which we grouped into psychiatric traits, so things like depression, anxiety, and apathy, empathy and emotional motivation, and utilitarianism. So they created these 3 distinct factors that then we can correlate with the parameters from our models. And what we saw was it was both utilitarianism and empathy motivation, that if you were higher in these, you were more likely to stop to act to help others, but there was no association with psychiatric traits. So this suggests that people who have these individual differences and they're higher in empathy or they're more utilitarian might be more willing to stop to help others. Okay, so to wrap that all up, what I showed you was that if we think about the computational level, effort, learning, and environment strongly influence our decisions to help others. And they might do so in a manner that's kind of distinct from helping oneself, which I think is very important. Secondly, although the computation might be different, we can use these very similar algorithms in order to understand social and non-social decision-making, but we might weight things like learning rates and K parameters differently. And finally, I suggested that there might be these distinct implementations, so that ACCG and subgenual ACC are necessary for pro-social effort and learning, and we might find other regions outside of these that are domain general, so they might do both self and other. And the next steps that we want to do is to take this multi-level approach to really understand pro-social behavior at the earlier part of the lifespan, from adolescence to adulthood, to look at those who have disorders of social behavior, such as those with conduct disorder, and to do this within this ecological framework. So I'd like to thank all the many people in my lab that contributed to all of this work. all of my collaborators, the funders of the research, and of course you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Patricia. I'm really mesmerized about the work you do. It's really, really interesting. And every time I just thought of something, you just answer that with another study. So it was really, really nice. We have some questions from the chat, if you don't mind. So Valdir asked you if the role of ventromedial prefrontal cortex on prosocial motivation is somehow related to its known function on subjective value computation. He asked if there are two qualitatively distinct processes or if they're kind of the same.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So I guess I'd revert to this kind of multi-level framework. So I think, these kind of effort computations and learning computations have the same quantitative construct in that we compute value in the same way for both of them. But I do think that we weight them differently by having these different learning rates or different discounting parameters. So I think the computation is similar, and we know that both of them do occur in VMPFC. But that's why I think what's really interesting is then within the broader VMPFC region, if we do lesion mapping, we can see these sub-regions that might have kind of this more social specificity. And those sub-regions that we see, so for example, the anterior cingulate gyrus, we know that it's got stronger connections to like temporoparietal junction, for example, than the more like dorsal part of the ACC. Or even within VMPFC, I didn't go into it too much today, but we found a more like lateral part of it, where if you had a lesion there, it actually made you more prosocial. So I think it depends on the kind of level of the brain you're looking at. And I think, yeah, this is all this work is consistent with valuation in a general way occurring in VMPFC. But I think there's something distinct maybe about the kind of smaller parts and how it's then implemented. But I think, yeah, it's kind of really hard because obviously we're not looking at the cellular level and stuff, and some people have done that in animals, so it's hard to know at what level that occurs. But I think that would be a really cool question for the future.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thanks. Nicole and I kind of had the same question, so I'm just gonna ask you, do you believe that there's an explanation for why, this is about the first study you presented, if there's an explanation about why age influences the way that we are prosocial? I was wondering maybe, because I know that older people usually have a more positive view of their old memories, and maybe they're more grateful, and maybe this would cause them to be more prosocial in this sense. But I don't know if you've investigated this in any of your work, or if you have any hypothesis. So it'd be nice to hear about that.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a hypothesis we had before we did the research that older people would be more prosocial. I think I was worried that they might not be because, yeah, all of the studies had been about money. And then, it's very hard to look at that. And also sometimes it's hard to distinguish like healthy aging from non-healthy aging. But I think that if we kind of dig deeper into the literature, there is, again, quite a lot of like animal work saying that specific neurotransmitters change quite a lot with age. So apparently levels of oxytocin remain quite stable as we get older, whereas we know that levels of dopamine decline. And of course, this is quite reductionist, but enhanced dopamine has been linked to like more selfish behaviors. So I think that there's definitely, just like how our motor abilities decline with age, or like our memory abilities, it's completely plausible that there is some kind of biological basis to our social behaviors changing as well. I, of course, think that, yeah, the more kind of sociocultural things, as you're saying, like there's lots of research showing the positivity bias in aging, and that can contribute to it as well. We found in the study that I very briefly showed that when we got participants at the end of the task to rate how they felt when they helped the other person, we found that both young and older adults rated exactly the same, that they felt positive helping someone else, and there wasn't a kind of group difference there. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, I think we should definitely do more research into how older people kind of feel about pro-social behaviors, because I don't think that's really been done. But I think there will be a biological aspect as well.
Yeah, thank you. That really makes sense. And finally, one last question from Nicole. Firstly, she said that she loved your study about pro-social learning, and she was thinking that about group dynamics. Would you expect different results if the patients without lesions were introduced to the others to kind of share a group identity? Maybe do you think that exhibiting similar characteristics and they would have more similar rates of learning for the self-condition if they were introduced to the other people?
Yeah, I think that's really important as well. So we were kind of trying to look at learning really stripped down, so you know nothing about the other person. We got people to rate how they felt about the other person at the end, and most people said that they thought they were similar, but that's probably because they were coming into like the same place in the same testing area. We have done some studies looking more at kind of, like in-group, out-group, or, how the identity of the other person changes, how much you know about them. So yeah, I think it definitely would, and that would be an interesting kind of intervention. I guess it's almost like an intergroup contact idea, that if you actually meet the person that you're playing for, but then there's some evidence that perhaps people with VMPFC lesions aren't so good at like picking up social cues. So it'd be interesting to see if that does really change their behavior. It's a great idea for a future study.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Once again, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Sorry about what happened. But yeah, thank you for staying with us. We've really learned a lot, and we hope maybe we can collaborate more in the future, because we're really interested in prosociality in the lab, and I think it would be really great in general. And now for everyone else, just want to tell you that we're stopping for lunch now, and we'll see you later for the postdoc presentations. And that's it. Thank you, Patricia, once again.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for all of your questions. Enjoy the rest of the meeting after lunch.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. See you at 2, guys.